A huge thank you to patron Rafe Zero Humor Singer for suggesting today's video topic. If you want to suggest a topic for next Wednesday's Name Explain video, all you have to do is support Name Explain on Patreon for $1 a month. Find out more by visiting patreon.com/nameexplain, which will be linked down below. Anyway, for those of us outside of the USA, and maybe even some from the country too, Pittsburgh might just be one of those cities you've heard of but don't really know all that much about. It doesn't have the wider cultural significance of other US cities like New York, Los Angeles, New Orleans, or even Philadelphia, which is in the same state as it. At this point, I imagine Scranton, Pennsylvania is more known of than Pittsburgh, thanks to a certain TV show. While I haven't been to the city, it does seem like a truly interesting place. Lying in the southwest of the state, the city of Pittsburgh has a population of just over 300,000, making it the 68th most populated place in the USA. The city is also the largest inland port in the nation, and has more bridges than Venice. It's the home of the banana split, movie theaters, the Ferris wheel, the Zippo lighter, and the polio vaccine. Notable Pittsburghers include the likes of Billy Mays, Andy Warhol, and former WWE World Champion and the man who won a gold medal with a broken frickin' neck, Kurt Angle. While this city may seem unassuming, it has a lot going for it. Another fairly unassuming thing about this city is its name. Pittsburgh sounds as close to a generic city name as you can quite possibly get. The Pitt prefix is pretty unassuming, and so is the Burgh suffix that crops up across the USA and other parts of the world. But despite how dull the name might sound, it's resoundingly fascinating. And it all has to do with its burgh. Pittsburgh's burgh is quite unlike many of the other burghs found across the USA. And it all has to do with the H found at the end of it. Normally, when the burgh suffix features an H at the end, the pronunciation changes to sound more like borough. This pronunciation of the suffix is often spelt in different ways around the world too, sometimes being spelt B-O-R-O-U-G-H, or even more simply B-O-R-O. If you want this suffix to make the sharper berg sound, akin to the word iceberg, then normally you don't bother with the H at all. Pittsburgh, meanwhile, decided to have its cake and eat it too, as the city's name uses the borough spelling, but is instead pronounced as Berg. That H really should not be there. Yet for a variety of reasons, it has persisted, making Pittsburgh's name one of the most unique across the USA. This suffix and its many forms can be found across the world, but the suffix's ultimate origins come from English's forerunner languages and the wider Germanic language family. In Proto-German, the Berg suffix simply meant castle or fort, as settlements that first had this suffix attached to it sprouted up around fortifications of some kind. The suffix can be found outside the English-speaking world and in other Germanic-speaking places too. Take Germany's Hamburg, Austria's Salzburg, Sweden's Gothenburg, and South Africa's Johannesburg. Over time, it became a more generic settlement suffix, regardless of if the town or city has its origins with a fort or not. The Berg suffix found its way into the Germanic language of Anglo-Saxon, which then became the English language we all know today. While burghs and boroughs with an H can be found across the UK, they aren't actually that common, specifically in England. This is because the suffix evolved somewhat in English and became borough. Borough is way more popular in England, with the likes of Farnborough and Gainsborough, as well as the slightly adapted Middlesbrough. I imagine that burgh morphed into borough in English due to the Norman influence the language undertook after the 1066 invasion. That's my own wild stab in the dark, but 9 out of 10 times that's the reason why British English is so weird. English is not the only language to be found in Britain though, as another part of this island and their language altered the Berg suffix too. Up in Scotland and within the Scots language, the Germanic Berg suffix evolved into borough, the spelling of the H on the end like we see in Pittsburgh. In Scotland, it is best seen at the end of their capital's name, Edinburgh. What this ultimately means is that this Germanic Berg suffix had changed into many different spellings and pronunciations in Great Britain, and when migrants from this island travelled to the New World and the British ruled colonies across the pond, all these forms of the Berg suffix came along for the ride. This resulted in burghs and boroughs of all sorts sprouting up across the USA before and after its independence. Take Harrisburg, also in Pennsylvania, Greenboro in New York State, and Ennisburg Falls in Vermont. Another thing that changed after independence in the USA was the language of English itself. The US wanted the version of English they spoke to be more unique to them than the English spoken in Britain. A key way in which they made their version of the language more unique is by streamlining it and removing much of the nonsense spelling British English has. This is why American English removed the U from colour and swapped around the R and E in words like centre. American English spelling just makes more logical sense. This change in the language was cemented in Noah Webster's first dictionary of American English, published in the early 19th century. The ultimate aim of American English was to make sure that the spelling of a word and the pronunciation of the word were in line with one another, so when you saw the word written down, you could easily pronounce it. This affected the various Berg suffixes too. It would dictate that pronunciation of the Berg suffix in the name would reflect how that settlement's name was spelled. So if a town was called Patrickburg, in example, they would use the B-U-R-G spelling, while if it was called Patrick Borough, then they might use the B-O-R-O-U-G-H or B-O-R-O spelling instead. This all makes logical sense, and on the whole, the USA follows these rules well, even if it results in some unexpected names. Take this city in Texas named after the capital of Scotland. Its name lacks an H on the end, so instead of being pronounced as Edinburgh as it is in Scotland, it's instead called Edinburgh. Most places in the USA follow the rules of this language nicely, but Pittsburgh seemingly isn't most places. With the H on the end, it would make logical sense if this city was instead named Pittsburgh. That of course isn't the case. Yeah, it turns out that American English from time to time can be just as illogical as British English. Pittsburgh's H should not be there. It's a strange anomaly and an otherwise much more sensible form of English. For some time, the language actually got its way and the H was removed. In fact, when the city was first founded, that H was not at the end of its name. That's because it wasn't called Pittsburgh at all. Some of the earliest names we have for this part of the USA are the various Native American titles the land went by. This includes names like Hoffa-Wicka-Mickey in Shawnee, which means the yellow water, Jeodionji, which means between two rivers in Seneca, and Teotiki in Mingo, which I have no idea what that name means, and I have no idea how well I pronounce those names. Apologies to anyone upset by those, but let's move on. The first name of European origins this location had, however, is seemingly Prince George Fort, a fort erected by the British in 1753, prior to US independence. The French would eventually force the British out of this fort and rename it Fort Duquesne. By 1758, the British had reclaimed it off the French and renamed it Fort Pitt. This name was in honor of British politician William Pitt, also known as Pitt the Elder, so he isn't confused with his son who had the exact same name. It was named after Pitt by the British due to the role he took on during the previous 7 Years' War, and the respect he gave to the people of the American colonies. He saw them as fellow citizens, as opposed to subordinates to Britain. Fort Pitt was established, and soon after a town grew around this fortification, with that town earning the title of Pitt's something. This is where things get a tad confusing in regards to the name of this town and its spelling and pronunciation. There's 3 potential contenders for what this town was dubbed. In a 1758 letter from John Forbes, the man who reclaimed the fort from the French, to Pitt the Elder, he told him the city was being named Pitt's B-O-U-R-G-H. Yet, when a city charter was finally granted in 1816, the original document spelt the name of the city as Pitt, B-U-R-G-H, like we see it today. Meanwhile, copies of that charter, which were sent around the city, supposedly featured a typo and printed the name as Pitt, B-U-R-G. From here, it's easy to see why the spelling and pronunciation of the city's names got so out of line. We don't know how this name was pronounced in the 18th and 19th century, as audio recording wasn't too much of a thing at this time, but from various spellings the city could have been referred to as either Pittsburgh or Pittsburgh when said out loud. Eventually, for some reason, the Berg pronunciation won out. Maybe because it was the name used on that copy which most people saw. Yeah, this city might have ended up being called Pittsburgh to this day if it wasn't for a typo. And while this pronunciation won out, the spelling we all know today with the H at the end stuck around for some strange reason. This gave us the city's name, which is pronounced as Berg, but spelled as it should be pronounced as Borough. It took some time how for this spelling to be standardized. When the city's name was formally standardized, that H was nowhere to be seen. In 1891, the United States Board on Geographic Names, who we will call Oostbog and Fries, decided that the spelling had to align with the pronunciation. So for the name to be spelled as everyone had been pronouncing it, the H had to go. This meant that from 1891, the city was officially called Pittsburgh without an H. This name made way more logical sense, but the people of the city were far from happy about it. Many people and establishments in the city refused to accept the name change. This ranged from local newspapers to even the university. They all insisted that the H should be there, and in 1911, the Oostbogen caved and gave the city its H back, after 20 years of it not being there. And their precious H is still there, even to this day. That H really should not be there, however. Yet, thanks to the muddled history and various forms forms that Germanic Berg suffix has acquired, the confusion over what the city was actually named in the first place, and the angry locals who didn't want it gone, the H still stands proudly at the end of the name in all its nonsensical glory. Pittsburgh is the most noticeable exception to the rule in the USA. Even other places named after the city in the USA don't break the rules. Pittsburgh in Kansas and California are both spelled B-U-R-G, which makes way more logical sense. This is a city that many people in the wider world have probably heard of but don't know too much about. But this unassuming city and its unassuming name have a lot of interesting history and confusion behind it. And finally, hello to anyone watching from Pittsburgh. Apologies if I didn't do your city justice. Please let me know some great things about your city down in the comments below. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm Name Explain YT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.